Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome our live stream viewers to today's event. For those of you joining us via the live stream, I'm sure you can hear that there is a room full of energised and engaged people here with us in Melbourne. But please welcome to today's ASIC Chair Priorities for 2022 and Beyond event with the Chair of the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, Joseph Longo. I'm Melinda Salento, the CEO of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Can I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting on today? For those of you on the live stream, obviously around the country, here in Melbourne, on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, but from everywhere, the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I would like to acknowledge and show my respect for Elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their continuing custodianship of culture, land, and acknowledge their contribution to our society through sharing their knowledge, their custodianship and their culture with all of us in the spirit of reconciliation. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank today's major sponsor, Gilbert and Tobin. They've been tremendous supporters of CEDA's, obviously through events like this, but also through a far broader program of work, and we very much appreciate their membership of CEDA and their ongoing support. I know that we are in for a very interesting conversation today. You can join in, for those online, you can join in via the Pigeonhole app, and also for those of you in the room, you can do likewise. If you'd like to ask questions through the app, you can also vote on other people's questions. But we will have mics in the room as well, I believe. That's it from me, other than to say, if you're on social media, we'd love it if you tag us and join us in the conversation. And with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Joseph Longo, and to acknowledge that joining him on stage shortly will be from Gilbert and Tobin, Richard Harris, and he's going to manage the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Always be careful going up steps. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's great to join you in Melbourne today, and welcome to all of you joining online. It's just fantastic to have so many people in the room. It's been a very challenging time for many people the last couple of years, so it's just fantastic to see you all here. Can I please start with a traditional acknowledgement of respect? I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present today. This event is my first address to the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. I'm into my second year as ASIC Chair. It sounds pretty amazing, but it is. And with little danger of overstatement, there is a lot going on in ASIC's ever-broadening regulatory mandate. I want to talk to you about some key trends, both here and abroad, and how these shape ASIC's priorities for the year ahead. I hope the discussion to follow will be lively, and if the conversation over lunch is any indication, it certainly will be lively. As we navigate what we all thought would be a post-pandemic world, societies and economies are facing complex change and disruption. The way we live and work is shifting, and so is the regulatory landscape. The recent CSIRO report, Our Future World, highlights the key global megatrends underpinning this disruption, including climate change, geopolitical shifts, the digital and data economy, artificial intelligence, and our ageing population. Internationally, governments, regulators and firms are sharpening their focus on climate change. Closer to home, we have witnessed the devastating impacts of more disruptive weather patterns and natural disasters. Technology and data are rapidly transforming the financial ecosystem. This trend has been evident for some time and is accelerating. More than ever, robust cybersecurity and cyber resilience capabilities are critical. Virtually every participant in our economy handles data in one form or another. I was reminded recently of a speech I gave at an ACCC event where I said, "The cyber world has made dramatic changes to the way the financial services industry operates. The independent forces of technology and globalisation will continue to be the major impetus for innovation and structural change in electronic commerce." There's a hint there. For the foreseeable future. It is these developments which pose both new challenges and opportunities for ASIC. Well, that was just 24 years ago, in 1998, when we thought that technology was simply grappling with the internet and what it had to offer. The technology we use now in our day-to-day lives has leapt ahead in ways and at a speed many of us could not have anticipated or predicted. ASIC needs to be a digitally savvy regulator so that we can keep pace. Technology, as well as recent reforms in our financial system, are reshaping what is expected of industry and the tools and data available to ASIC. I want ASIC to be an ambitious and confident regulator, one that is focused on the future, always looking ahead. Our remit, when compared to our international peers, is remarkable. As commentators have frequently observed, no other corporate regulator in the world has the range of responsibilities that have been given to ASIC. However, there are some constants. Ultimately, it is ASIC's capacity, when the circumstances warrant it, to take forceful enforcement action that lies at the heart of its effectiveness as a regulator. Our appetite to take matters on has not diminished. Where we see egregious misconduct, we will act. Our action will be targeted, timely and proportionate. Rather than attempting to be everywhere, we must prioritise the areas of greatest harm and take action to protect vulnerable people. Being a regulator is all about choices, so we must be targeted in the way we deploy resources. So, now to our priorities. Yesterday I released ASIC's corporate plan. Now I just want to depart from my prepared remarks to say, this is the ASIC corporate plan. And I'm often asked, what is going on at ASIC? What are you doing? Please read the corporate plan. I was about to say it was a ripper, but anyway. But the corporate plan, I'll be focusing today on our core priorities. So in this corporate plan, our core external and internal priorities and the action we plan to take to give effect to those priorities now and over the next 4 years. Of course, we will remain responsive to new trends and issues. We have identified 4 external strategic priorities: product design and distribution, sustainable finance, retirement decision-making, with a focus on superannuation products, managed investments and financial advice. Technology risks, with a focus on digitally enabled misconduct. Our plan describes 8 core strategic projects which set out the action ASIC plans to take to advance these 4 priorities. In the time I have today, I will outline our approach on 4 of those projects. Improving sustainable finance practices and disclosure of climate risks, supervising and enforcing design and distribution obligations, the so-called DDO regime, addressing market integrity issues and investor harms in relation to crypto assets, and disrupting and combating financial scams to protect consumers. Why are these areas important to us? Each responds to a key emerging challenge that we face. Each is focused on protecting people participating in the financial system, and each is an explicit enforcement priority for us. No doubt, these are issues that many of you are grappling with too. So first is sustainable finance practices. As climate change and sustainability become the dominant themes of our times, we are seeing investment increasingly being driven by values-based decisions. In response, there has been a proliferation of investment products and companies appealing to consumers with sustainable or green investments and net zero emission promises. Core ASIC business is to ensure that firms comply with disclosure requirements and do not mislead investors. It follows that improving climate-related governance and disclosure are key priorities for ASIC. Regulation of climate and sustainability promises is a global issue. Australia relies on more than $4.1 trillion in foreign investment to help power our industries, fund our services and create jobs. As more and more Australian firms release financial reports and disclose climate risks, we need to speak the same language as our global peers. ASIC strongly supports the development of globally comparable standards. We cannot go it alone with our own language or our own standards. Our fellow regulators agree, and that's why we lodged a joint submission to the International Sustainability Standards Board on its proposed standards, that joint submission being the Council of Financial Regulators. We will continue to engage with peer regulators here and overseas to ensure we are aligned on this. Half of the ASX 200 companies are already voluntarily reporting against global benchmarks, but our surveillance shows more needs to be done. Of course, climate-related disclosure must comply with the law. Crucially, the information must be useful and accurate for investors. If you make net zero claims, you must have substance behind those claims. Aspiration on its own is not enough. The bar is set much higher. We want to ensure that firms moving towards net zero do so with integrity, fostering trust and practicing transparency. Through our supervisory work, we're testing green investment offers and targeting false claims by firms. Labels or headline statements about a product's green credentials cannot be misleading. If a product issuer promotes an investment opportunity and states that they will take sustainability into account as part of their strategy but doesn't explain how, this simply isn't enough. How is this going to help investors understand the product's investment strategy? Firms are expected to explain how they will take sustainability into account using specific and clear language. We are actively monitoring the market, looking for dubious claims, also known as greenwashing. Serious breaches will fall foul of the misleading and deceptive disclosure provisions of the Corporations Act, and we will take enforcement action. Turning now to DDO and the design and distribution obligations. The DDO regime is a game changer for the regulation of financial product design and distribution in Australia. Selling products now requires clear consideration of the objectives, financial situation and needs of the consumers being targeted. DDO is about protecting consumers' interests and reducing the risk of harm caused by poor design, distribution and marketing. The obligations became law in October last year, and we've now shifted our focus from facilitating implementation to active supervision and enforcement. Recently, we investigated a firm called Responsible Entity Services, RES, because we were concerned about a product being marketed to retail investors and others, including retirees. RES was offering an opportunity for people to invest in the Pleasant Point mine via a related fund. RES issued a target market determination, which is a mandatory public document, which proved to be flawed. In the case of RES, the product was a high-risk, illiquid, unlisted, single-asset investment. Its only underlying asset was a loan, which meant any potential returns for investors was wholly dependent on the borrower's ability to repay the loan. However, RES's original TMD included people who intended to use the investment as a core component of their portfolio and others seeking high capital growth. We considered the product didn't meet the needs of the investors in the original target market and placed an interim stop order on RES. A TMD is a critical document requiring careful thought and consideration to get right. Have I identified the targeted consumers correctly? Have I thought through what distribution conditions and restrictions are appropriate? And also importantly, have I correctly specified the review triggers that reasonably suggest the TMD is no longer appropriate? RES shows that where issues get target markets wrong, we will step in and prevent those products being sold. In the months ahead, you can expect ASIC to focus on sectors where consumers are at the greatest risk of harm. We have targeted surveillance action underway to identify and disrupt poor conduct in relation to high risk and complex products, such as over-the-counter derivatives and crypto. We are reviewing product governance arrangements in the small amount credit and buy now, pay later sectors. We're looking at how target market determinations were developed, including the data, metrics and other key considerations that underpinned these important public documents. We're also conducting a surveillance of a sample of TMDs in the superannuation and managed fund sectors and engaging with major supervised institutions on how they are implementing DDO. Where our surveillance work identifies poor consumer outcomes, we will disrupt the sale of the products using stop orders or take court-based enforcement action. In future, you can expect us to look closely at the way firms collect, assess and respond to data about consumer outcomes from their products. It's critical that firms respond to poor outcomes that they identify, either by making the necessary changes to their products or to their product governance arrangements. These obligations require firms to be proactive. It's not a case of set and forget. Ultimately, we want to see the long-term benefits of DDO being realised. Strong and robust compliance with DDO will support fairer outcomes for consumers and a stronger financial system for all Australians. I now want to turn to crypto. A financial innovation full of promise, celebrity and volatility. In recent years, there has been a sharp increase in retail investor interest and activity in global markets, including crypto. This upswing was amplified further by the onset of the pandemic. We recently released research focused on investor behaviour from the onset of COVID-19. Of the 1,000 investors surveyed, more than 50% were aged 18 to 34, and our research showed that cryptocurrency was the second most common product type held by 44% of respondents, after Australian shares, which were held by 73% of respondents. For a quarter of crypto investors, it was their only investment. Often drawn in by promises of high returns and slick advertising, many investors believed their money was safe. But as we have seen, the value of crypto assets has dropped by around $2 trillion in recent months. In May this year, the so-called stablecoin, Terra, uncoupled from its algorithmic peg to the US dollar and plummeted in value, losing US $40 billion in one day. ASIC's essential warning to consumers considering crypto assets is this: they are highly volatile, inherently risky and complex. I'm concerned that investors do not fully understand what they're investing in or the very significant risks. The research I referred to earlier revealed that as many as 80% of those investors did not even consider crypto as being risky conduct. Think about that. 80% of the people getting into crypto did not think it was risky conduct. This is a major concern. ASIC will continue to prioritise this area over the next 12 months and beyond. Our crypto regulatory strategy has 3 cornerstones. First, we support the development of an effective regulatory framework and greater regulatory clarity for this class of products. We welcome yesterday's collective announcement of the Treasurer, Assistant Treasurer and Assistant Minister in particular. We welcome the focus on consumer protection. Second, we will continue to take enforcement action to disrupt and deter harmful products already within ASIC's jurisdiction. This includes those that mimic traditional products or seek to circumvent regulation. And third, we are collaborating and cooperating with our domestic and international peers. Coordinated action and standard setting is important because the crypto ecosystem does not observe borders or the jurisdiction of any single Australian regulator. Insights and intelligence gained internationally help us prepare for emerging risks and inform our work with the Treasury and the government on the most effective regulatory framework. We are also seeing an increase in scams, many purporting to be linked to crypto assets. This brings me to our work to disrupt scams. It's no use thinking that scams are only for the gullible. These days, there is a scam for every person. We are all vulnerable. I would like to also emphasise that scams are an area where our corporate allies, business community, are key. Australians lost a record amount to scams in 2021, more than $2 billion. Investment scams, our focus, were the highest loss category at more than $700 million. Those losses represent great harm. Think of young parents caught up in a payment redirection scam as they attempt to purchase their first home. Think of the distress felt by an investor discovering that an email offering corporate bonds, seemingly from their own bank, had in fact been false and their savings are gone. The size and scale of the problem is immense. It can feel like a game of cat and mouse as we pursue scammers and try and get ahead of the increasingly sophisticated techniques they use. Our strategy is to disrupt their operation using innovative data-driven approaches to drive early intervention and, where possible, prevent loss to consumers in the first place. As I said earlier, our corporate allies are key to scam-proofing Australia, and financial institutions are right in the middle of this issue and this effort. We have work underway with several banks to look at their scam identification and response strategy. Many banks have sophisticated scam detection systems in place already, but further improvement is needed. Over the last few months, we've met regularly with digital platforms, including Google, to discuss advertising of financial products. You may have seen Google's recent announcement requiring advertisers wanting to promote financial products and services in Australia to demonstrate they are licensed by ASIC or are exempt from being licensed. This is an expansion of the verification process that it put in place in the UK last year through the Financial Conduct Authority. We have recently worked with the ACCC to trial a service that takes down fraudulent websites. The trial was very successful, and we are working with third-party service providers to digitally disrupt investment scams. We are also complementing our regulatory and enforcement interventions with regular and targeted warnings aimed at educating consumers about scam trends and specific scam threats as they emerge. This is a challenge that ASIC cannot confront alone. Coordinating our response to scams of industry, other regulators and consumers is critical to protecting people from further losses and preserving the integrity of financial markets. Before concluding, I'd like to turn now to three broader regulatory efficiency initiatives underway at ASIC. These are important initiatives for me. They contribute to how we administer the law more effectively and how we can make it easier for you to interact with us. We are taking a coordinated approach to this work. Earlier this year, we consulted widely, speaking to more than 70 stakeholders. As you might expect, we got plenty of feedback. Using that feedback, we have started work on three initiatives aimed at streamlining our interaction with you. First, we will look at how we engage around the development and maintenance of our regulatory guidance, recognising that this is a core aspect of our regulatory footprint. We also want to publish more detailed regulatory timetable to help you know what is coming and to support you in your planning. The second work program looks to enhance our engagement when we use compulsory powers to gather information. The aim is to help ensure our engagement is transparent, targeted and efficient. We want people to understand what the relevant investigation is about, the steps involved, and what is expected of them. Third, we are reviewing our stakeholder engagement approach, exploring a more regular and multi-channel engagement, using ASIC's engagement with licensing applicants as a case study. This will help you to better understand our priorities, expectations, and decisions. All of this work supports my ambition for ASIC to be confident in discharging our regulatory and enforcement responsibilities to serve and advance the public interest more effectively. I look forward to our discussion with Richard, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. That was great. Hello, everyone. My name's Richard Harris. I'm the head of the Disputes and Investigations Department at Gilbert and Tobin. I've been asked to moderate the questions for Joe from the audience, and I've got a couple of my own. Really do want to encourage everyone in the room and those of you watching online to ask questions. This is a great opportunity for CEDA members and those guests attending to talk to one of the most important regulators in the country and to raise the things that are of concern to you. There are multiple methods by which you can do that. Those of you in the room, obviously just raise your hand and someone will find you with a microphone, and if I can penetrate these lights, I'll definitely call on you. And I also have an iPad here that questions are coming in online, so feel free to put your questions in and they can be voted on as well. I should start by thanking Joe for what was an excellent speech and taking the time to enlighten us all on what ASIC's priorities are for the coming period. I have a few questions. Do want people to raise their hand, but perhaps I should get the ball rolling, Joe, if you don't mind. While I definitely hope that we'll get back to talk in a little bit more detail about the actual priorities that you just outlined, I was interested in, just perhaps a better understanding of the process that ASIC goes through to identify those priorities, the way in which you think about it, and perhaps allied to that question, perhaps not, is whether or not you've yet had any chance to get a sense of the new government's priorities and how they gel with some of the priorities you just outlined.
Well, I think the starting point is that the approach we're trying to take today and in the corporate plan is to really respond to a need to explain what ASIC's priorities are. See, we all know ASIC has a broad remit, it does a lot of different things. But there's a real demand, I think, in the community to say, well, what are your priorities? What are you focused on? And so part of my thinking, our thinking, is to be clear about that. Because I don't think anyone really expects us to be everywhere at once. But what they do expect is to understand, well, what are the key things ASIC's worried about? And what is it going to do about those things? And then to take responsibility for those choices. Because in the end, regulation and enforcement is about choices. Now, the way, I don't think there's any particular mystery in the way we came up with these priorities. I think they reflect a lot of internal work, emerging threats and harms work we do. We have a committee and a capability dedicated to that. We also have a range of consultative panels that we engage with, that we ask what they think are the issues that are occurring in the economy or in the community that we should be engaged with. We talk to peers internationally and domestically, and then we form our own view about what we think the important priorities are. And but at bottom, it's really important, I think, that the market and the general community understand what we're about and why we're doing it. Now, your second question about government priorities, all of these priorities were in the sort of in the pipeline, under consideration before the election, after the election. I think, in fairness to both the outgoing government and the incoming government, the priorities we've identified have, I think, a consensus. The climate change, crypto, scams. These are all themes and issues that are of central significance to any government. As far as the incoming government is concerned, all I can do is repeat what they've already said. They've got a very significant emphasis on dealing with scams, which, as I said in my prepared remarks, is a major problem here and overseas, and does require more attention. But the climate change and disclosure issues are all things that we as a planet, as a community, have to focus on. So from my perspective, the approach we're taking is aligned, consistent with government expectations, whether before the election or after.
Excellent, thank you. Why don't we start perhaps with crypto? Just because there's a few comments coming through and they're a little bit more detailed than perhaps my overarching comment. I mean, obviously crypto is a huge influence, a big part of the way in which people are thinking about the transfer of value and investment. I guess my question is, just given the breakneck pace at which the technology around digital currencies and the businesses that focus on digital currencies are developing, and given the global nature of those businesses and the many different jurisdictions that might be involved in those kinds of businesses, is there really a chance for ASIC to ever properly be able to regulate that industry?
Well, there are a number of themes coming out of that. The first is, as far as, unlike climate change, climate risk disclosure, I think we're a long way from getting a global consensus about what to do about crypto. The Europeans, for example, their legislation won't take effect till 2024, and they're still working on it. The SEC has taken a position. The FC, I think the UK government is somewhere in between, being probably a little bit more liberal. So I think the first point is we will have to design a regulatory framework that suits us, that works within our existing legal and regulatory arrangements. That doesn't mean we won't get some good ideas from what's going on elsewhere, but I think from a practical perspective, I think the starting point will be, what do we have now? How can we regulate crypto within the existing framework? The second thing is that I find this topic endlessly fascinating. It's going to be very hard to regulate. And so what the government has announced, that it's wanting to complete its NFT, non-fungible token review, and then work through a proposed regulatory framework. It's enormously complex. People talk about cryptocurrencies like there's like half a dozen, or so, but they're actually, depending on how you count, between 8,000 and 10,000 versions of crypto assets or currencies, and they're essentially limited only by the imagination of code makers, the people that actually create the underlying code, and then the imagination and commerciality of those who wish to promote one or more of these things through whatever mechanism. So I don't think anybody trying to understate the complexity of it. But in the end, the way I like to understand it is that my job is to be frank with the Australian people about this subject. And to my mind, this is a highly risky, highly volatile activity, and you should be really careful before you do it. And so regulation is coming. And that will help with some aspects of the problem. For example, dealing with custody arrangements, for example, and there will be licensing arrangements probably for digital currency exchanges and other sort of service providers that are part of the crypto ecosystem. So I think all that regulation is coming. But in the end, I think for now, my key message is be careful. It's a highly risky activity. And that is really the sort of the heart of it from my perspective. And then and consumer protection arrangements, I think, will be a key feature of the regime. I suppose the only other point I'd like to make in these circumstances, because it's not my job to be a crypto cheerleader. My job is to protect consumers and to administer the law as it is. ASIC is not against innovation, and will do whatever it can to look for lawful ways of using the underlying technology, the distributed ledger, the blockchain technology. We all know that it's really interesting technology that has a number of uses, potentially very beneficial uses, but that's not to be conflated or confused with investing, inverted commas, in a crypto asset. And I think consumers need to be very careful about that.
Given just how technical it is, and both in expertise and then the cost of obtaining that expertise and the technology you might need to deal with it, Does ASIC have the resource to try and tackle it?
Oh, I think that we actually have a really excellent internal team who's been studying this for some time. I'd say at least 2 or 3 years we've been building up an expertise internally. So I have a lot of confidence in our internal expertise, and we're working closely with Treasury and with the Council of Financial Regulators. I mean, not anyone speaking frankly about this in the regulatory world, we're all learning. I mean, you can't have 8 or 10,000 versions of something globally and expect to be on top of it all. And so there's a lot of complexity there. But in terms of our engagement, I think we have a good team working on this. I think we're plugged into what's going on internationally. We're talking to a lot of people in industry. So I think we know what's going on. I don't have any concern about that. I think the real issue here is consumer protection. I take every opportunity to say, be careful. And secondly, we're working very closely with government to design a regulatory framework that hopefully will be in the interests of consumers.
Related to that question, the most popular question from the floor at the moment, also on crypto, which oddly just disappeared, but I'll ask it anyway. Why isn't there regulation on crypto advertising?
Well, I go to the footy too. It's on our radar. When you say why isn't there regulation of it, that's not quite the way I would put the question. The question is whether it's misleading and deceptive and breaches an existing law. So,
or whether it should have a gambling warning associated with it.
Again, that is a matter for what the law might say. So, for example, I think crypto is, as I said earlier, endlessly fascinating. But when I think about crypto, I can also think of, it's in the corporate plan, by the way, in the middle of it, there's a paragraph dealing with complex managed investment schemes and complex property structured schemes that we're trying to focus on as well. So my warning to consumers isn't just about crypto. It's not investing in anything you don't understand. So if it's very complex, if it's highly structured, if it's being hyped up, if it sounds too good to be true, well, you shouldn't be doing it. And so we know the crypto advertising, I mean, really, we will have our own view about it, but I do accept that the advertising can be quite extravagant, but whether it's illegal is another matter.
Yep, thank you. Moving on to a different topic, another question from the iPad, potentially the floor, potentially people out in the world. Protecting retirement savings is a priority mentioned in the plan, but not expanded on a great deal in your talk. Can you comment on how to reconcile returns with the ideas we've seen surface today re super investing in nation building?
I can't comment on what, I think the Treasurer made some remarks earlier about that. What ASIC's focused on is, and again it's in the corporate plan, we look at how the retirement covenant works, intra-fund advice, superannuation, performance requirements, metrics and the communication of them, insurance products within superannuation. So we're very focused on administering the regulatory framework around superannuation jointly with APRA. And so there are lots of initiatives that are taken together and designed to ensure that the interests of members are properly advanced. But the legal framework around regulation of superannuation is quite comprehensive. It's changing. So that's our focus. It's making the system work the way it was intended to work. And a lot of the issues are actually to do with systems and processes and infrastructure. The extraordinary sums of money are under investment. Most Australians have a stake in that. And so we're very interested in making the system work for all Australians.
Perhaps related to that is the relationship ASIC has with the superannuation regulator, APRA. And much has been made, I think, over the last few years about the newfound cooperation between APRA and ASIC. Perhaps not newfound, but particularly the overlap between regulators in relation to conduct in super, as well as administration and consequences arising from the BEAR and the FAR regimes.
Yeah.
How does that cooperation work in practice, and how do you feel it's going?
I think it's in the time I've been chair, I think it's been excellent. Just to give people some idea of how intense it is, there's a quarterly meeting between the ASIC commissioners and APRA members. It's just among ourselves, and everything's on the table. And of course, those meetings are informed by agendas and papers, and we alternate chairing it. And then there are a whole number of working groups. So there's one on enforcement, for example. So you mentioned conduct regulation. Now, clearly we are, broadly speaking, a conduct regulator, and APRA clearly is more a prudential regulator, and that's the Twin Peaks model we have. It's served us well in Australia, coming out of the Wallace inquiry. It's been looked at from time to time by those with a particular interest in that. So I think from a systemic point of view, what we have in Australia between APRA and ASIC is a good model, and I think serves Australia well. You mentioned BEAR. BEAR is about to be replaced by FAR, Financial Accountability Regime. It didn't get passed in the last Parliament, but I think it's going to be passed shortly, and likely to commence sometime next year. So when the time comes, the market can expect a joint statement by APRA and ASIC of how we intend to jointly administer that regime, and what approach we will take to enforcement jointly, and how we plan to supervise. So I think it's fair to say that we are acutely aware of the market expectation, which is, by the way, I think an entirely reasonable one, that the resources of APRA and ASIC will be sensibly deployed. We're not going to be duplicating each other's efforts, and there will be coordination. So I think they're the key points. I think there is a lot of interaction, I'd say daily, between the two regulators. Superannuation sort of comes to mind as well, where I suppose of all the things from an enforcement perspective, I think it's fair to say I think ASIC has been a lot more active in enforcement in connection with matters superannuation, and all of that has arisen in consultation and cooperation with APRA as well. So I think that's working well. That doesn't mean things are perfect. The whole point of engagement is that if we hear of an issue or a friction of some kind, then tell us, and I'll look at it. Yeah.
A big part of your talk, a big part of the plan is the focus, or ASIC's focus, on disclosure around sustainability,
yes,
greenwashing claims and the like. It's got a fair degree of media focus over the last couple of days since the plan has come out. To be honest, I was a bit surprised that it features as highly, just given, is that where true customer detriment lands? But clearly it is a point of emphasis within ASIC, and that must be a sign that it's quite prevalent. Just how prevalent?
No, it's a good question. I think there are two aspects to it. I think that the consumer protection detriment part of it, I would, the way I look at it, greenwashing. So if you're a consumer, you're entitled not to be misled by extravagant claims about the green credentials of a product or service. And that's, I think, a good general principle. We don't tolerate that in Australia, misleading and deceptive conduct in those sorts of circumstances. And it's entirely unfair to those businesses and entities who are doing the right thing, for some other business or entity to go off and overstate their credentials in an area that we know consumers may be drawn to. So the greenwashing part of it, I think, that's the point. We want entities to be on a level playing field, and for investors to know what they're investing in and have a proper transparency, an appropriate transparency. The other major feature here and is that what's really struck me about sort of spending more time worrying about these issues the last 12 months, and this goes back to my comment about going global, it's really extraordinary the amount of effort and energy and resources going into these topics internationally. There's a real momentum and recognition that common disclosure standards around climate risk is an essential feature of the world's response to this problem. So that sounds pretty profound, because it is. This is an issue that affects everyone, and from my perspective, from the humble world of disclosure, if we can't find a way of talking about the risk in a common way and in a sensible way, and allocate capital appropriately, then that is going to lead to very significant poor results for our community and our economy. So this work is urgent. I mean, we have two commissioners working on this, the Deputy Chair Karen Chester and Commissioner Hughes has spent a lot of time dealing with these issues. We're very active in international committees. Our Chief Accountant is chair of one of those committees. A lot of really, for those people who are in this area, I'll give you an example. I made the mistake of printing off the SEC's draft rules or something back in June, 400 pages of material. And so the amount of technical work that needs to be done here is quite extraordinary and has to happen quickly. So I hope I've made that. So there's a greenwashing piece, but all that other work has real impact on capital raising, capital allocation in the economy.
Follow that. And do you think the existing regimes for misleading and deceptive conduct and the constructs of PDS, etc., are sufficient tools?
That's a really good question. I think one of the virtues of the misleading and deceptive conduct regime in Australia sort of started when I was a baby lawyer is its simplicity. You know, that's a general principle, and I think that's stood Australian jurisprudence really well because it captures such a wide range of situations. The climate risk and sustainability, something we're talking about now, it's harder. And one of the reasons it's harder is that we don't have a common language to talk about some of the issues. And so that makes it harder sometimes to say, well, was that really misleading or deceptive or not? Now, and so I think there's an emerging, to be frank, there's an emerging jurisprudence and approach to that. The ASIC's focus on this is really the last couple of years. And so one of the things, so for example, you might say, oh, we're green, and then you have to go through 6 internet pages before you get to the footnote that says, well, what we really meant was something else. So I think it's that. So part of the judgment in whether something is misleading and deceptive is to step back and say, well, read as a whole, would a reasonable person, when reading that, would they be misled? And, that can lead to reasonable people having different views. So that's, but we are looking for matters to run where we plan to test the boundaries of some of these issues.
Oh, I was going to ask that. Should we expect some enforcement action soon?
You can always expect enforcement action at ASIC.
Bit of practice development.
There's one constant at ASIC, is lots of enforcement action.
I think there's some questions on the floor.
Hi, thanks so much. Jennifer Hill from Monash Law. Joe, you've really focused a lot on the climate change disclosure issue. One of the points that's really coming out overseas at the moment is the extent to which executive compensation should have a component that is related to ESG and sustainability, and that these kinds of issues should be integrated into executive pay. To what extent are you seeing that in Australia at the moment, and to what extent would you be hopeful that that would give incentives for the kind of conduct that you're looking for? Well,
executive REM's always a battlefield. I I think this is an area APRA has done a lot of work in, and it hasn't been an area that we've directly focused on from an ASIC perspective. I have had personal experience of executive REM regimes and their capacity to influence behaviour. I think that there's a potential for that for executive REM regimes to drive the behaviour we're looking for. I'm not sure where that question comes from, by the way. Okay, I'm sorry. There's no doubt that there's an established view, which I think is valid, that the executive REM arrangements can have a significant impact on executive behaviour. And in fact, that's a key feature of FAR, that we will have consequences reflected in people's REM as part of that regime. Now, that concept can be applied to everything. The premise of your question was sort of climate risk, but the issue can be generalised, can't it? You can generalise that point and say, whatever our expectations are of senior managers or executives, we want to see those expectations reflected in some form of consequence and remuneration management. So I think that's pretty as far as I can take it today.
Was there another question on the floor? Sorry.
Hi. Look, I might, just get one more question in before we finalise. And look, it's on climate risk again. And look, I'd like to thank you also for your address. It was very good. It made me worry a bit about all the scams on my phones and the sort of crypto claims I keep getting. But look, I'm also on climate risk. Now, I hear what you've said about greenwashing. My question probably just takes it a bit broader. Obviously, Australia's on the verge of setting new climate targets. It's also introducing a safeguard mechanism, which a lot of businesses will be caught up in the emission reduction schemes. I'm also aware, and you might have probably seen this, overnight, as I was reading the Financial Times, and the EU has also introduced some very onerous standards for reporting of climate risk. So I suppose, in a long-winded way, my question is this. For a lot of businesses who are not out there trying to greenwash, who are just sort of doing this sort of normal business, but will be caught up in this emissions reduction net, for want of a better word, and will have to expose climate risk, just how far do you think we will have to go in Australia, considering we have got a lot of climate risk in Australia, a lot of resources companies and a lot of energy companies, how much further do you think Australian business will have to go to fully inform investors about climate risk in Australia?
Yeah, no, it's a terrific question. The part of the work on the global stage, there's a lot of what I would call broad principles and standards that lean into the issues we're talking about. And then there's a whole piece of work which is really difficult work, about how that plays out domestically. So different jurisdictions have different legal regimes, they have different cultures, they have different models. And so that's sort of the next level of challenge, to implement at country level these concepts that we've been touching on. And then to go to your question, it's like it cannot be one size fits all. So we have very large institutions in Australia who are well resourced and well advised and have been working on this issue for some time, and indeed participating in the standard setting processes. And there are a lot of other businesses who simply don't have those resources and aren't there yet. So I think part of our challenge as the regulator is, one, to make our contribution to getting the right standards, and then there's a whole piece of work ahead of us on what the implementation should look like, and how nuanced it'll need to be for businesses in Australia. So I think it's very complex work, and this is work that's going to take years. We're not talking about this is all going to get done in the next 18 months. I think this is going to be something where ASIC and other regulators are going to have to work very closely with business and with the firms that are affected by these standards to get it right. The greenwashing part of it, to my mind, is a here and now issue that we think we can be taking some action on, and that shouldn't be confused with the much more ambitious short to medium to longer term work we need to do in this area. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions, or a few more, if you're still up for it, Joe.
I think my watch has gone flat.
One of the themes that's coming through the questions online, which perhaps worth asking about, is do you have a view on the relevance of individual misconduct, directors' duties, directors and officers' duties, and whether this is a particular focus of ASIC's at the moment, individual responsibility for corporate misconduct?
Oh, that's a terrific question. It's something I think about all the time. It's one of the issues facing, it's one of our challenges to figure out what our strategy should be there. And that's what we have BEAR, we have FAR coming. There's clearly a desire, an expectation to have individual responsibility, that directors or senior officers of companies need to be held accountable for what for the issues that they may have caused the company. And I think that will always be a focus for us. But the other issues that sometimes often arises, as you look at corporate misconduct and you're looking at the entity and the expectations or needs of deterrence and enforcement may be sufficiently met by just going after the entity and not after individuals who might have been caught up in the same behaviour. So, but broadly speaking, I think this is an area that you can expect us to continue to be active in, but I don't find it straightforward. We have a very developed, for the lawyers among us, my whole professional life I've been reading about directors' duties, and we have a very developed jurisprudence in Australia on it. And it really is matters for judgment when in particular circumstances that misconduct or breach of duty rises to a level where the regulator is going to take action against those individuals together with the company or not. So I don't think there's any simple formula that will explain all the circumstances in which we'll take action. I think the only other thing I would say is I think Australians' expectations of directors remains very high. The community expects businesses to be well run and ethically run. And I mean, I've appeared before other groups, Australian Institute of Company Directors, for example, and I know a lot of effort goes into trying to maintain high standards. So that's our balancing act, to focus on what is a real problem and litigate that or investigate that, but otherwise to also encourage high standards of behaviour.
Depends.
Yeah, it
Still
depends.
A lawyer.
Yeah. Well, you'd expect that from a measured law enforcement agency.
I think that's all we have time for, but thank you, Joe. Really fascinating session. There are a lot more questions here that I could have asked. People are genuinely interested.
Well, tell them to read the corporate
Congratulations on
plan.
the plan.
Yeah, tell them to read the corporate plan. I'm hoping it'll make the New York Times recommended book list, at least for this week.
I'm not so sure.
It's right here. It's right here. I carry it around. That's my personal copy.
In case you haven't noticed, if you haven't read it yet, please read the ASIC corporate plan. Joseph and Richard, thank you so much. So much in that conversation. We could have kept talking for a long time. There are a lot of questions still in Pigeonhole as well. A couple of takeouts for me. For everyone in this room, there's a scam for every one of you. Don't forget that. If you don't understand it and it looks too good, don't invest in it. But in all seriousness, I think we were talking about some really important issues that affect us all, and we can use jargon or language that maybe doesn't connect, but I think when Joseph was talking really clearly about the challenges of climate and how we think about risk and how we think about capital allocation, that sits right at the core of so much of this. And when you take it from climate to other risks, that's really what we're talking about. And then, of course, truth in advertising, that we want people to be able to understand what's going on and understand that the decisions that they're making and where they're putting their money, and that, of course, sits at the heart of our financial system and the trust in it. I am going to extend an on-stage offer that obviously these issues are super complex. At CEDA, one of the things we're increasingly trying to do is make sure that we bring together all the stakeholders we can to have the right conversations. We're doing this more and more in different formats, including most recently in what we call collabs, where we bring policymakers and ministers and others into the room to have frank Chatham House rule discussions to try to influence the direction of policy and understanding where there is nuance and where you need a shared vision of what the best way forward is. So we're happy to do that on all things ASIC or more broadly. A couple of other little sales pitches, if you don't mind. If you haven't already noticed, we are running our State of the Nation conference again this year, of course, in Canberra, September 8th and 9th. We've just got a really crackerjack lineup. So if you're interested and available, please jump on the website, ceda.com.au, and have a look at that. And just finally, on a theme that was resonant today, we are also establishing or have established a community of best practice on ESG, which is really about bringing our members and experts together to understand what best practice is, what people are trying to do in their organisations, how they're communicating that with their employees, stakeholders and investors. So if you have any interest in that, please speak to one of the team, or again, you can jump onto the website and find out what we're doing there. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see you all in the room, and I look forward to seeing you next time.